Now, George Osborne's plan to enforce prudence in government by legal means has already faced some criticism. He wants a measure to ensure that neither this nor any future government can spend more than it brings in, mainly through taxes. A similar idea has been tried out in Germany before, but Labour says the Chancellor's plan is simply a distraction to the existing deficit. With me now is Anne McElvoy, Senior Editor at The Economist magazine, and from Westminster, Sam Bowman, who's Deputy Director of the think tank, the Adam Smith Institute. Thank you both for coming in.
Hi.
And first of all, is this politics or economics?
I think it is more politics than economics for a number of reasons. One is that George Osborne thinks that he's winning the debate on austerity. We've seen a number of candidates for the Labour leadership saying, yes, we should have spent a bit less in the run-up to the crash, and also by definition that they had a problem with their economic policy in the election campaign and their defeat. So if you like, he's crowing a little bit. He's saying we got it right, and therefore what I've got right I want to enshrine in law. The other reason I think it's more politics than economics is if you look carefully at the small print, goodness, who'd have thought politicians and small print, it says things like in normal times. Well, the definition of normal times in the economy is very variable, and I think a future government, be it Tory or Labour, would not feel hugely constrained by this. It would simply find some amendment or some kind of rider that would say, actually at the moment we want to run a stimulus and we're going to run it over a bit longer than perhaps George Osborne's legislation would imply.
Sam, is there any economic argument for this?
There is, actually. One of the big problems is that governments, there might be an argument for governments running deficits during recessions. That's the Keynesian view of things. But there's not really an argument at all for governments running deficits during good times. In fact, Keynes himself argued that the time for austerity is the boom. And it's very, very rare, though, to see governments actually do that and actually tighten the belts when times are good. Now, if this law does come into effect and if governments do abide by it, and I think Anne probably does have a point that they'll figure out ways of wriggling out of it, but if it does come into law, what it will mean is that if the government does want to switch from a surplus to a deficit, it's going to have to repeal this law. And that means bad headlines, and it means that members of the public will be able to take notice. Because one real problem is that lots of voters just don't know what deficits are, and they don't know that when the government is borrowing to spend money, it's going to have to raise taxes sometime down the line. So it is mostly politics, but there is a good economic case for running a surplus in good times, and I'm glad that this law is coming in.
There's an argument, Anne, that when there are good times, it matters less, because if GDP is growing, actually the problem sort of sorts itself out anyway.
It does, and I think that's why what we've got is something that seems to be slightly retrospective, i.e. George Osborne is saying, let's have a law that is going to lay down what I'm doing already. Yeah, you could question whether that's the best use of lawmaking. I mean, I take Sam's point, and I largely agree with him about trying to run surpluses, or at least aim to balance the books in good times. But I think it's a bit odd for a libertarian, Sam, to be arguing, stick this stuff into laws, particularly when we think that the law is a kind of pliable instrument. And that is really the bit that I kind of feel like I'm counting the spoons a bit. Maybe perhaps too many chancellors. I feel that sometimes one has to look a bit beyond the headline of what they're saying to how practical it really is.
Yeah, Sam, it's that phrase, when times are normal. I mean, one doesn't have to look too far back when times weren't normal at all. And the one thing we learn about politics is you can predict nothing.
Well, that's true, but just to go back to Anne's point, during the Brown years, actually Blair ran a surplus for many years, but during the Brown years, he realised that he could spend more and more money, hopefully for him winning more and more votes, and people wouldn't really realise that someday they were going to have to pay the bill. So I think the real point of this bill the real point of this law is that this kind of forces governments to be honest with the public. Yes, if they want to raise spending, fine, but they're going to have to raise taxes as well, or they're going to have to come clean with the public and say that we're going to eventually be taxing you somewhere down the road to pay off this debt. The problem with this is that it's very, very much in the bubble, it's very much in the beltway, where we're all very comfortable with deficits and debts and things like that. Most people aren't. Most people don't know what a deficit is.
But I don't know that the law makes much difference.
Kind of thing. And the good thing about this law is it makes it clear to them.
I don't think the law makes it at all clearer. I think if you're confused about debt and deficit, you're still going to be confused afterwards. I suppose what I'm worried...
Well, doesn't a law clear that problem? Because if you know there is a law to stop either of those, then you know we're safe from both.
It's not really a law. I mean, I hate to contradict the Chancellor. It's an expression of an intent. And it's a bit like saying, here, this is what we think should happen. As soon as a different government is in power, of whatever complexion, I think they would be able to revisit this. I think what it does very cleverly is underline the fact that the the austerity agenda that the Conservatives set in motion, that they feel they've won that argument. And I think that's the really interesting thing that's going on in the economic argument at the moment. If you're not going to summon up some Keynesian academic or someone on the left of Labour, an awful lot more people are saying, you know what, it seems to have gone all right. That's what he's underlying. He can't control the future. Politicians have enough trouble controlling the present.
Sam, the one thing that strikes me, if there's a law, if he breaks it or a future Chancellor breaks it, what happens? Do they get fined even more money, or perhaps they serve a bit of time in clink? I mean, what really will happen?
That's a good question. I'm not sure, actually. I think the real point is no government wants to be seen to be breaking the law, so what they'll do is they'll just repeal it. And Anne is right that any government can repeal any law. But that's also the point. It's very difficult. There is inertia in politics, and many laws that are passed, even if a government is elected opposing those laws, as we're seeing with the Human Rights Act, in fact, it's very difficult for them to repeal them. It's very difficult to go backwards. So it's true, this isn't cast iron, this is not a handcuff on a future Chancellor, but it will make it a little bit more difficult for governments to run deficits when times are good. I think that's a good thing, and I think forcing the government to be honest with the public about how taxes are being spent and how much borrowing is going on can only be a good thing.
But what this is, Anne, it's a good headline.
It's a good headline. I think if you want to kind of look for the proof of why it doesn't work, look at the Eurozone, all those marvellously dreary conferences I attended in the 90s, talking about balanced budgets, about 3%, you weren't allowed to borrow more than 3% of GDP. Look what happened to that. It went out of the window. The Eurozone now bears the problems that go along with it. And the fact that it was enshrined in a lovely bit of bound leather didn't matter at all when the facts changed.
McElvoy, Sam Bowman, thank you both very much for that.
Thank you.
Join us.